To discuss this further, we were joined by the independent immigration policy expert Dr. Sarah Kayambi and Paul James Cardwell, who's a professor of law with a specialist interest in immigration. Sarah, how would a Scottish visa system work?
Well, the visa is kind of the central stone in a wider raft of policies here. But the idea is to provide an additional entry route for Scotland to which the Scottish Government would set the criteria and possibly also assess and select and nominate candidates. And then there are a few options here. So either the Scottish Government would then check candidates for eligibility, or that would be the role of the UK government. But the UK government in either case would have the power to then check identity, make security checks and visa issuance powers.
And what criteria would the Scottish Government be looking to use?
Well, so they haven't specified that, but what they've specified is why they need this. And that's very much related to Scotland's labour needs, but also very much to its population needs. So I would expect these criteria to be related to trying to identify and attract those migrants who want to come and live in Scotland and actually settle here, and those who can contribute to the wide range of industries in which they're needed in Scotland, which might be slightly different to what's in England. And I think there's a very strong focus on trying to attract migrants to come and live in rural and remote areas to offset depopulation in those areas.
Paul, how would this really work within a UK system?
Well, this, of course, has been untested, although many other areas of devolution have, of course, now been tested for 20 years. So there is some uncertainty. And, of course, on the part of the UK government, which has already really rebutted this proposal without giving it very much thought, I think probably the worry is that, well, actually, this could be a route into perhaps getting an easier visa for Scotland and then actually disappearing and working elsewhere in England. So it's partly about enforcing that the visa does what it is supposed to do. And
how could that actually work? Because it does seem fairly obvious that somebody may come into Scotland and then head to London.
That's true. I mean, there are other examples. So the paper that the Scottish Government put out today uses Canada as an example, where you have Quebec, which has a very different set of procedures and visas available for people going to different parts of Canada, and even in the other provinces as well. There are differences too. So it can work, and certainly with the amount of devolution that we've seen over the past 20 years, things like tax and addresses and residence, it's possible to establish that someone is actually living and working in Scotland.
And so you would see it working fairly smoothly?
Well, it depends on how it's done. I mean, as Paul has said, in countries like Canada, provincial nominee visas work very well, and some of them have very high retention rates, even into rural and remote areas. I think what the proposals do today is they say why it's needed. They also say how they would identify who these migrants are using the Scottish tax code. But there is a need for more dialogue between the two governments in terms of enforcement and how that would work in practice. But I think there is actually the need for that partnership working to happen to some extent. And as you've said, the UK government have simply dismissed these proposals today. So it remains to be seen how those types of adaptations that are clearly needed in the immigration system can be made. And there is a report coming out later this week from the Migration Advisory Committee. So it remains to be seen whether the UK government have other ways of moving beyond the one-size-fits-all immigration system that we've currently got.
Sarah touched on it there, Paul. Okay, it might be possible to people who come to Scotland would remain in Scotland rather than going to a different jurisdiction in England. But a lot might be required for rural areas, depopulated rural areas. How can you get people to stay there within Scotland?
Well, I think that's actually the bigger problem, rather than the relationship between Scotland and the rest of the UK. How do you ensure that people go there? And also, even if you do it in terms of job requirements and so on, if it's in a certain industry that exists in the big cities as well, how do you get people to do there? And I think that's going to be a very more difficult nut to crack overall. And there's an even bigger question about whether people will want to come to the UK. There is uncertainty over that, particularly given the ramifications of Brexit and the end of free movement. And in attracting or trying to attract migrants, the UK and Scotland is in competition with many other developed countries as well, such as Canada, but also European countries. So there is some uncertainty, even if everything is put in place, as exactly how it will work and also how successful it will be.
And that's a key point, Sarah. How attractive might Scotland be to migrants who can move, as Paul says, anywhere?
I think that's a difficult one to answer, and I think Paul makes a very relevant point. This is a global competition for talent, but I think you can't attract people if there are no routes in. So Scotland is arguing that there do need to be routes in that are appropriate for what Scotland needs, and certainly on the rural and remote locations challenge, what we've seen today is the announcement of proposals to pilot schemes or research into schemes for addressing some of those challenges and using migration in that context to address some of those issues. It's not the only solution there, but it's part of a wider series of policies that's needed to address that kind of depopulation. But I think, if the proposals are like the ones in the immigration bill last year, we know that in some rural and remote locations in Scotland, nobody is able to meet the £30,000 threshold that was suggested at that point in time.
And would the Scottish Government sponsor the applicant rather than the companies, which is what happens in some other countries?
Well, that's something that's been suggested in this paper, that under the Scottish visa, the Scottish Government would act as a sponsor instead of using an employer sponsorship mechanism. I think that's a very interesting proposal, and it's got some merit. And it's particularly apt in Scotland, I think, because the employer sponsorship system that we have at the moment is incredibly complicated. It's very burdensome for business. So in practice, it's actually only larger businesses that can really make use of it. And in Scotland, the proportion of small to medium enterprises is much higher than for the rest of the UK. So that we do need to kind of work a way around how we get these mechanisms to work in a way that's more appropriate to the Scottish economy and the Scottish context.
And Paul, just finally, once the migrants here, and we're talking about them staying in Scotland or staying in a rural area, that's actually quite a restrictive restriction on their freedom, is it not?
Well, that's right. I mean, it's one thing to say, well, come and live permanently in Scotland, but how do you enforce that? And absolutely, this is one of the key challenges. And given that written all through the proposals today is about permanent residence, it's not just filling a gap for a few years and then assuming people will go home. It is about permanent residency, and I think that's going to be one of the most difficult issues to resolve if this proposal goes forward.
Paul, Sarah, thank you both for joining us in Scotland Tonight.